In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Ecarlate. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion.
This can best be described as a very gentle tone of red. Not faded, gentle. There's nothing loud or obnoxious about it. While it doesn't shade in a standout kind of way, it definitely does. And that's something I generally don't go for, or more specifically, tend to avoid in red. But it is being done very well here. Now, I don't see a bottle of this in my future, but that's not because of anything wrong with this ink. I already have a bottle and a backup bottle of the red ink that I prefer. Now, if I already didn't have that stash set aside of red, which I don't actually use an awful lot of, I could certainly see going after this. It's almost a shame that they brought my favorite ink back from the dead only because I don't really go for many other reds because of that. I use them and filter them in reviews, and they're fun to look at, but I don't consider the bottle, which is a shame for this ink.
I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is
a Nimicine Fission with a broad nib.
It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the fine nib, we get a nice gentle red that has no feather, no spread. We see the shading coming through fairly well and in just about every word. It's not jump out at you in most words. Now on the third line with those or the H and other, yes, it's much more noticeable, but look at could on the second line. As it gets darker into the end of the word, it's very gently rolling into it. Looking at the medium nib, it is in general a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It's performing just as well though. It has no feathering. It has no spread. Now the shading is definitely there, but what we more see is lighter areas from the majority darker tone that we're getting with this. Like you see in Tried, starts darker, gets lighter, and dark again on the first line. English on the second line. Look at that. Aristocracy goes lighter to darker to lighter. So nice. The stub nib is about the same tone that we had with the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. And I don't think it is necessarily shading as well as the medium, but I think it's shading quite differently. Certainly a lot of it, but it's definitely different because we're seeing more transitions, but I don't see the transitions as being as drastic in what's going on. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems.
To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, the tone, while it's still gentle, looks a little duller than it did on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. We are seeing some shading that goes on. You see it in honors. The H is darker than the rest of the word. You see it in the word accomplishments, where certain letters definitely get darker than the others. It's pleasant here, but I don't think the tone is coming across as nice as it did on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, the difference between this and the Clairfontaine is rather slight, but it's just about as slight as we're seeing with the fine. It's only a little bit darker than the fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not giving very much in terms of how the shading had come through before. Now, if you see widowed on the second line, there's certainly some tone variation there. It's just not standing out as well here as it did previously. Looking at the stub nib, we have a little bit darker in general than we did with the medium. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. Now, we're getting some shading, but it tends to happen more word by word. Home does start darker and get lighter. One is light. Whom tends to start darker and get lighter. But for the most part, what we see is a word in a consistent tone and a next word in a slightly different tone. Unusual way of shading. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that came through and bled to the page underneath, and I don't think you're going to have any issue writing on the back of the pages. There's almost no ghosting. Only the medium had a little bit of issues. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, the first thing I see is it's a light red. The background made it from gentle to kind of more like a faded red tone in what we're getting here. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. There are a few moments you will see some shading. You see it in dispensable. More you see it in that on the second line, the word the is darker than everything else around it. For the most part, the shading doesn't come through very well with this tone paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the fine. It is still not feathering. It is still not spreading. It is still giving some shading. I think the thicker nib of the medium has brought some of its shading out a little bit better. You see the word he on the second line goes darker to lighter. Went from lighter to darker. To goes back to that very monotone, but on the third line, close, the L gets darker, the H gets darker, but the rest of the word is lighter. Very nice. Looking at the stub nib, we have basically the same tone as the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is giving some shading, but only when I'm actually going over where I've already written. So when you see the cross in the T, it's a little bit darker right there. When you see the downstroke of my Y hits the upstroke of the T from the first to second line, slightly darker, but certainly not shading here. Looking at the back of the page, we get a lot of ghosting with the medium and stub, not so much with the fine. You could probably use the back of the page and get away with it. I don't know that I would, but it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we're getting that kind of faded red again. Makes me feel like it's really the tones of these papers that are causing it. We're not getting any kind of feathering or spread. We do get some shading that's going on. You see it in the T of it, the T of about, both on the first line, but in the P of deep on the second line, it's there. Thought starts darker, gets a little bit lighter and a little darker again, but then it gets light on the beginning of the word visitor until it gets darker, so it's shading fairly well. Looking at the medium nib, it is, in general, quite a bit darker than we had with the fine, in general. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. Now, it's mostly the dark tones, but it does put out some of the lighter tones like we saw on the fine, which is pretty good. The beginning of untouched starts much lighter and gets darker. When we look at sat, starts lighter and gets darker. When we see the word when right in the middle of all of the writing, it looks much darker than the word empty directly underneath it. Looking at the stub nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the medium, about the same as the darker tone. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It does kind of shade sometimes. Really, in the first line, you see goes lighter to darker, but the majority of the writing is the darker tone without some shading. Not to say that it doesn't happen. The word noted right in the center does look a bit lighter, but for the most part, it's a solid darker tone. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that bled through and touched the page underneath, and the ghosting is way under control. You can easily use the back of the page.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Blackstone Kunzia Red. Here is Diamine Passion Red. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Red No. 1. Here is Sailor Clown Teardrop Ruby.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get that gentle tone back, and while this is still a toned paper, it seems to gotten back to gentle and not faded here. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's basically not shading. We do see a couple of instances, a very light peppering, if you will, of some shade from time to time. The first L in all, it's there. The H in hall, it's there. The X of accept is the exception, of course. Looking at the medium nib, it is, in general, I think just a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. I think it shades a little bit better. You see the word heels goes darker to darker, and starts lighter and gets darker, while his is a very consistent darker tone. So it's definitely there and definitely possible. I don't know that this is a paper that people run to in the expectation of shading, but I think it is doing pretty good here. Looking at the stub nib, it is about the same tone that we had with that medium, which is a little darker than the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. I think it shades much better than the fine did, which is one of those things that you hope for with a stub, and it is doing. Look at how special goes darker to lighter to darker. Breakfast, darker to lighter to darker to lighter to darker. It's shifting back and forth. It's like a politician trying to get voters. The flippy floppy. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is no problem. You can easily write on the back of this page. There's no bleeding, of course, so you can easily use the page underneath.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here's a blue-black ink by Bookbinders, Red-Bellied Black Snake. Here is a shimmering gray ink by Pen BBS, their number 261. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis, their Robert Koch Adular Blue. Here is a black ink by Noodlers in their Warden series, Bad Black Moccasin.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, it is an uninteresting red tone, but this is copy paper, so... Anyway, we get some feather, we get some spread. Both of them are well under control. Both of them are actually doing very well if you really wanted to use this. Is it shading? Technically, yes, we get some darker spaces. You see his is definitely darker than teeth and at, which is underneath it. So it's certainly there. You could use it. I wouldn't. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. Does it feather? Yes, it does. Does it spread? Yes, it does. Does it shade? Yes, it does. Kind of a surprise with the last one, but it is still shading, so I'll consider that pretty good. I'll call it a win. Even though it feathers and spreads, both of those are well under control. Looking at the stub nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the medium. It feathers. Yes, it spreads. Yes, it's manageable. Yes. Would I use it? No, but I avoid this paper as much as I can. It does technically have a couple of moments that show up darker, but I don't really want to call this shading. For the most part, we have one tone here. Looking at the page underneath, we had two spots where it did come through on the medium, only put the tiniest mark there, so you still could use the page underneath. We see that the ghosting is really under control, although I still wouldn't write on the back of the page.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
I think the tone looked the crispest. Crispest. I don't know. It looked its most crisp on the Clairfontaine with the stub nib. But since Clairfontaine isn't my always paper, I would really recommend going with a good, wet, fine nib for this pen. I think it's going to give a very nice writing experience the entire time, and even with some of the cheaper papers, it's going to look good. Just keep in mind the way the toned papers had a tendency to make it look a little faded and not soft-spoken.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did do all that YouTubery stuff, thanks for watching.